The blood on her cheek had dried hours ago, but Josephine Lancaster still felt its weight like a brand marking her as property. She stumbled through the dense California forest in 1875, her threadbare dress catching on brambles, tears streaming down her face as she ran from the man who called himself her husband, though no preacher had blessed their union. Behind her, she could hear Marcus shouting, his voice carrying through the pine trees with promises of what he would do when he caught her. And Josephine knew every threat was real because she bore the scars of his previous lessons carved into her skin where no one could see. She burst into a clearing and collided with something that felt like a wall of solid muscle. Josephine screamed and threw her hands up to protect her face, certain Marcus had somehow circled around to catch her. Strong hands gripped her shoulders to steady her, and she looked up into the face of a stranger, a man so large he seemed to have been hewn from the mountains themselves. His shoulders were broader than any man she had ever seen, his chest thick with muscle beneath a worn buckskin shirt, and dark hair fell past his collar, tangled with bits of forest debris. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jaw covered in several days of stubble, and eyes the color of storm clouds that looked down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Please," Josephine gasped, trying to pull away. "Please, I have to keep going. He'll kill me if he finds me." The mountain man did not release her, but his grip gentled, becoming supportive rather than restraining. "Who will kill you?" His voice was deep and rough, as though he spent more time talking to the trees than to people. "Marcus. He'll be here any moment." "I have to run." She tugged against his hands, panic rising in her throat like bile. "Please let me go." Instead of releasing her, the mountain man moved her behind him with surprising gentleness for someone so large, positioning his body between her and the direction from which she had come. "Stay behind me." Josephine wanted to argue, wanted to run, but her legs were trembling from exhaustion and fear. She had been running for hours, ever since Marcus had passed out drunk after beating her for burning his supper. She pressed her hand against the mountain man's broad back, feeling the solid strength of him, and wondered if she had simply traded one danger for another. Marcus crashed through the undergrowth moments later, his face red with exertion and rage. He was a tall man, lean and wiry, with the kind of cruel beauty that had fooled Josephine when she first met him in Stockton. That felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been 8 months since she had accepted his offer to work at his claim, desperate for any employment after her father's death left her penniless. "There you are, you stupid girl." Marcus's eyes gleamed with malice. "Get over here now, and maybe I will only use my belt. She stays where she is." The mountain man's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath the words. Marcus's gaze shifted to the stranger, and for a moment uncertainty flickered across his face. The mountain man stood at least 4 inches taller than Marcus, and his body was thick with the kind of muscle that came from years of hard labor in unforgiving terrain. But Marcus had always been more foolish than smart, and the whiskey still running through his veins made him bold. "That is my woman. She belongs to me." Marcus took a step forward. "I suggest you mind your own business, stranger, unless you want trouble. She does not look like she wants to go with you." The mountain man crossed his arms over his chest, the movement making his biceps strain against his shirt sleeves. "Looks to me like she is running from you. What I do with my woman is none of your concern." Marcus's hand dropped to the knife at his belt. "Now step aside before I cut you." The mountain man did not move, did not even seem concerned by the threat. "You can try." Josephine saw Marcus's body tense, saw him start to draw the knife, and she opened her mouth to scream a warning. But the mountain man moved faster than she would have thought possible for someone his size. His hand shot out and caught Marcus's wrist before the blade cleared its sheath, squeezing until Marcus cried out and dropped the knife. Then the mountain man's other hand grabbed the front of Marcus's shirt and lifted him off his feet like he weighed nothing at all. "The lady does not want to go with you," the mountain man said, his voice still calm despite the violence of his actions. "So you are going to turn around and walk away. And if I ever hear of you bothering her again, I will come looking for you. Do we understand each other?" Marcus struggled for a moment, his feet kicking uselessly in the air, before he nodded. The mountain man set him down and gave him a shove that sent him stumbling backward. Marcus caught his balance, his face twisted with humiliation and rage, but he was smart enough to recognize when he was outmatched. He turned and disappeared into the forest, though not before shooting Josephine a look that promised this was not over. When Marcus was gone, the mountain man turned back to Josephine, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The question, asked so gently after such violence, broke something inside her. Josephine felt tears spill down her cheeks, all the fear and pain and exhaustion of the past months overwhelming her in a rush. She tried to speak, but could not force words past the sob caught in her throat. The mountain man took a step toward her, and Josephine flinched backward instinctively, her hands coming up to protect her face. She expected anger at her reaction, expected him to grab her roughly like Marcus always did. Instead, the mountain man stopped immediately, his expression softening. He raised his hand slowly, and Josephine squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow. It never came. Instead, she felt the gentlest touch against her cheek, calloused fingers brushing away her tears with a tenderness that made her chest ache. When she opened her eyes, the mountain man was looking at her with such concern that fresh tears spilled down her face. "It is all right," he said quietly. "You are safe now. I promise I will not hurt you." Josephine wanted to believe him, but trust was not something she could afford anymore. Still, when her legs finally gave out beneath her, it was his arms that caught her, cradling her against that massive chest as though she were something precious. She should have fought, should have been afraid, but exhaustion claimed her instead, dragging her down into darkness while the mountain man's steady heartbeat drummed against her ear. When Josephine woke, she was lying on a bed of soft furs inside a small cabin. The walls were rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, and sunlight streamed through a single window, creating patterns on the dirt floor. She sat up quickly, wincing at the pain in her ribs where Marcus had kicked her, and looked around wildly. The mountain man sat at a rough wooden table on the far side of the cabin, carving something from a piece of wood. He glanced up when she moved but made no attempt to approach her. "There is water in the bucket by the door, and bread and dried venison on the table if you are hungry." Josephine's throat was parched, but she did not move. "Where am I, my cabin?" "About 5 miles from where we met." He set down his carving and knife. "You passed out. I did not know where else to take you." "Why did you help me?" The question came out more harshly than she intended. The mountain man considered her for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes unreadable. "Because you needed help." It was such a simple answer, delivered without expectation of gratitude or reward, that Josephine did not know how to respond. In her experience, men never did anything without wanting something in return. "What do you want from me?" Pain flickered across his face, quickly hidden. "Nothing. When you are rested, I will take you wherever you want to go." "I have nowhere to go." The admission hurt, but it was the truth. She had no family, no friends, no money. Marcus had made sure she was completely dependent on him. "Then you can stay here until you figure it out." He stood, and Josephine's breath caught at the sheer size of him. In the confined space of the cabin, he seemed even larger than he had in the forest. But when he moved toward the door, he gave her a wide berth, as though afraid of frightening her. "I need to check my traps. I will be back before dark." After he left, Josephine remained on the bed for a long time, trying to understand what had just happened. Finally, thirst drove her to the water bucket, and once she had drunk her fill, hunger led her to the food on the table. The bread was coarse but fresh, and the venison was perfectly seasoned. She ate mechanically, her mind turning over the problem of what to do next. She could not stay here. It would not be proper, and Marcus would eventually find her. But she had no money for a stagecoach, and the nearest town was Stockton, where Marcus had friends who would turn her over to him without a second thought. The only other option was to head further into the mountains and try to find work in one of the mining camps. But a woman alone in those places faced dangers that might be worse than Marcus. Josephine spent the afternoon exploring the cabin, which was surprisingly well kept for a bachelor's home. Everything had its place, from the cooking implements hanging on the wall to the neat stack of firewood by the hearth. There were no personal items, no photographs or letters, nothing to indicate who the mountain man was or where he had come from. The only decoration was a pair of fur pelts hanging on one wall, the craftsmanship so fine they must have taken months to cure properly. True to his word, the mountain man returned just as the sun was setting, carrying 2 rabbits and a string of fish. He paused in the doorway when he saw Josephine had moved from the bed, but said nothing as he hung his catch from a hook near the door. "What is your name?" Josephine asked, breaking the silence. "Patrick Barlow." He began cleaning the fish with practiced efficiency. "What is yours?" "Josephine Lancaster." She hesitated. "Thank you for helping me today and for the food." Patrick nodded but did not look up from his work. "You are welcome. I cannot pay you. I did not ask you to. Most men would." The bitterness in her voice was impossible to hide. This time Patrick did look up, his gray eyes meeting hers steadily. "I am not most men." Something in the way he said it made Josephine believe him. She watched him work for a while, noting the economical grace of his movements despite his size. His hands were large and scarred, the hands of a man who worked hard for his living, but they moved over the fish with surprising delicacy. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. 3 years. Patrick finished with the fish and moved to the rabbits. "I came west after the war." "Which side did you fight for?" "Union." "Spent 4 years watching men die for ideals that seemed to matter less with every battle." His jaw tightened. "When it was over, I wanted to be somewhere quiet, somewhere far from people and their wars." Josephine understood that impulse. After months of living with Marcus's violence, she wanted nothing more than peace. "Do you ever get lonely?" Patrick was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Finally, he said, "Yes, but loneliness is better than bad company." "I suppose that is true." Josephine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the cabin. "Patrick, I need to ask you something." "What is it?" "Do you expect me to share your bed?" She forced herself to meet his eyes as she asked, needing to see his reaction. "Is that the price for your help?" Patrick's face hardened, and for a moment Josephine's heart stuttered with fear. But when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "No, Josephine, I expect nothing from you except what you freely choose to give. You can sleep on the bed. I will make my bed by the fire. But it is your cabin, your bed. And you are my guest." Patrick hung the cleaned rabbits next to the fish. "A guest who has been through an ordeal. I will not add to your troubles by making you uncomfortable." Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes again, and she blinked them back furiously. She would not cry in front of this man again, would not show such weakness. "Thank you." That night, Josephine lay in Patrick's bed while he slept on the floor wrapped in a fur blanket. She stared at the ceiling, listening to his steady breathing, and wondered how a stranger could show her more kindness in one day than Marcus had in 8 months. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she slept deeply for the first time since her father died. The next morning, Josephine woke to find Patrick already up and making breakfast. The smell of cooking meat made her stomach growl, and she sat up carefully, testing her sore ribs. Patrick glanced at her but said nothing until he had finished cooking and placed a tin plate of rabbit and fried bread on the table. "Eat," he said simply. Josephine did not need to be told twice. The food was simple but delicious, seasoned with herbs she did not recognize. When she had cleaned her plate, Patrick refilled it without comment, and she ate that too, suddenly ravenous. "Better?" Patrick asked when she finally set down her fork. "Much, thank you." Josephine wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Patrick, I need to figure out what to do. I cannot just stay here indefinitely." "Why not?" The question caught her off guard. "Because it would not be proper. People would talk. There is no one around for miles to talk." Patrick poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the fire. "And even if there was, I do not care what they think. But I cannot just live here. What would I do? How would I pay my way?" Patrick considered this. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Clean, mend clothes?" "Yes. But then you can pay your way by taking care of those things while I work my trap lines and hunt." Patrick said it as though it were the simplest thing in the world. "Winter is coming. It will be hard for both of us to prepare, but with 2 people it will be easier." Josephine stared at him. "You would let me stay here, a woman you just met, a woman who needs help." Patrick met her eyes. "I am not asking anything from you, Josephine. If you want to leave, I will take you wherever you want to go. But if you need somewhere safe to stay while you figure out your next step, you are welcome here." It was too generous, too good to be true. Josephine had learned that kindness always came with a price. But looking into Patrick's eyes, she saw only sincerity and a quiet understanding of what it meant to need refuge. Against her better judgment, she heard herself say, "I could stay for a little while, just until I have a plan." Patrick nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Then it is settled." The days that followed fell into an easy rhythm. Patrick left each morning to check his trap lines, which stretched for miles through the surrounding forest. While he was gone, Josephine cleaned the cabin, mended his worn clothes, and prepared meals from the supplies in his larder. It was harder work than it sounded. Water had to be hauled from the creek, clothes had to be boiled in a pot over the fire, and cooking on a hearth required constant attention. But it was also satisfying in a way Josephine had not expected. For the first time in months, she felt useful rather than burdensome. Patrick never spoke much, but his presence was oddly comforting. He moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, never crowding her, always aware of where she was and careful not to startle her. When she flinched at sudden movements, which happened often, he would freeze and give her time to calm before continuing whatever he was doing. He never asked about Marcus or what had happened to her, respecting her privacy even as his care slowly helped her feel safe again. One evening, about a week after she had arrived, Josephine was washing dishes when she realized Patrick was carving something by the fire. She dried her hands and crossed to look over his shoulder, curious what occupied so much of his free time. In his large hands was a wooden figure of a bear, so detailed she could see individual claws and the texture of its fur. "That is beautiful," she breathed. Patrick glanced up at her, seeming surprised by the compliment. "Thank you. I like working with my hands. Have you made others?" In answer, Patrick rose and went to a trunk in the corner of the cabin. He opened it and pulled out several more carvings: an elk, a wolf, an eagle with its wings spread wide. Each one was a work of art, capturing not just the shape of the animal but its spirit. "Patrick, these are incredible." Josephine picked up the wolf, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "You could sell these in town. I do sometimes. That is how I buy the supplies I cannot make or trap." He carefully packed the carvings back into the trunk. "But mostly I make them because I enjoy it. Will you teach me?" The question came out before Josephine could stop it. Patrick looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "If you want to learn." That became their evening routine. After supper was finished and the cabin was clean, Patrick would give Josephine a piece of wood and a knife, and patiently show her how to work with the grain, how to make shallow cuts for detail and deeper ones for shaping. She was terrible at first, her attempts looking more like mutilated lumps than anything recognizable. But Patrick never criticized, only offered gentle suggestions and encouragement. "You are getting better," he said one night as she held up a passable approximation of a rabbit. "You are kind to say so, but this looks nothing like yours." Josephine turned the carving, examining its lopsided ears. "It looks like your first attempts, which means you are learning." Patrick took the rabbit from her and studied it seriously. "See how you have captured the alertness here, the way its ears are turned. That is good observation." The praise, so simply given, warmed something inside Josephine that had been cold for a long time. She looked at Patrick's profile in the firelight, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. He was not handsome in the conventional sense, too rough and weathered for that, but there was something compelling about him. A strength that went beyond his impressive physical presence. A gentleness that seemed at odds with his size but made her feel safer than she had in years. As autumn deepened, the work of preparing for winter intensified. Patrick began teaching Josephine about life in the mountains, showing her which plants were edible and which were poisonous, how to read weather signs in the behavior of animals, how to preserve meat and vegetables for the long months when fresh food would be scarce. Josephine absorbed everything eagerly, grateful for knowledge that might help her survive if she ever had to be on her own again. But increasingly, she found herself hoping she would not have to leave. The cabin had become a sanctuary, and Patrick's presence a comfort she had not known she craved. She caught herself watching him sometimes, admiring the play of muscles across his shoulders as he split wood, or the concentration on his face as he carved. And sometimes she caught him watching her too, his gray eyes holding an expression she could not quite read before he looked away. One afternoon in late October, Josephine was hanging laundry on a line strung between two trees when she heard horses approaching. Her heart lurched into her throat, and she dropped the shirt she was holding, spinning toward the cabin. Patrick emerged immediately, drawn by the sound, a rifle held loosely in his hands. "Get inside," he said quietly. But Josephine could not move, frozen by the fear that Marcus had found her. The riders came into view a moment later, 3 rough-looking men on horseback who studied the cabin with calculating eyes. They were armed, with the kind of hard faces that spoke of lives lived on the wrong side of the law. "You there," one of them called, a man with a thick beard and a scar running down his left cheek. "We are looking for water for our horses. Creek is half a mile that way." Patrick pointed with his rifle. "Follow the deer trail." The scarred man's eyes shifted to Josephine, and she saw recognition dawn on his face. "Wait a minute, I know you. You are the girl who ran off from Marcus Sullivan's claim. He has been looking for you." Josephine's blood turned to ice. Patrick shifted, putting himself between her and the riders. "The lady is under my protection. Tell Sullivan if he wants to find her, he will have to go through me." The scarred man grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "Marcus is offering a reward for her return. $50. That is a lot of money for one little girl. She is not going anywhere." Patrick's voice was flat, final. "We will see about that." The scarred man's hand dropped to his pistol. What happened next occurred so fast Josephine barely saw it. Patrick swung his rifle up and fired, the shot echoing through the forest. The bullet kicked up dirt between the scarred man's horse's hooves, making the animal rear. The other two riders yanked their horses back, hands raised in surrender. "The next one goes through flesh instead of dirt," Patrick said, already working the rifle's lever to chamber another round. "Now get off my land before I decide you are worth the trouble of burying." The scarred man wrestled his horse under control, his face twisted with anger, but he was smart enough to recognize the danger in Patrick's steady hands and cold eyes. "Sullivan is not going to forget this. He can come see me himself if he has something to say." Patrick took a step forward, his massive frame radiating menace. "Now ride." The men turned their horses and galloped away, disappearing into the forest. Patrick lowered his rifle but did not relax, his eyes scanning the trees for several long minutes. Finally, he turned to Josephine, who was trembling. "Are you all right?" he asked. "They know I am here." Josephine wrapped her arms around herself. "Marcus will come for me. I need to leave before I bring trouble to your door." "You are not going anywhere." Patrick's voice was firm. "And I am not afraid of Marcus Sullivan or his friends. You should be. Marcus does not forgive slights, and he considers me his property." Tears burned in Josephine's eyes. "I cannot let you get hurt because of me." Patrick set down his rifle and crossed to her, moving slowly so as not to startle her. "Josephine, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, seeing determination in their gray depths. "I meant what I said," Patrick continued. "You are under my protection. That means something to me. I will not let Sullivan or anyone else take you." "Why?" the question burst from her. "Why do you care what happens to me? You do not even know me." Patrick's hand rose toward her face, then hesitated, waiting for permission. When Josephine did not flinch away, he gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized had fallen. "Because you deserve better than to live in fear. Because helping you is the first thing that has made me feel human in 3 years. Because when I look at you, I see someone worth protecting." The raw honesty in his voice broke through Josephine's defenses. She stepped closer to him, drawn by the warmth radiating from his massive frame, and before she could think better of it, she pressed her face against his chest. Patrick's arms came around her carefully, holding her as though she might break, and Josephine let herself cry for everything she had lost, and everything she was afraid of losing. When her tears finally stopped, Patrick did not release her, and Josephine did not pull away. They stood together in the fading afternoon light, finding comfort in each other's presence, while the forest whispered its secrets around them. That night, Patrick did not sleep. He sat by the window with his rifle across his knees, watching for any sign of Marcus or his men. Josephine lay in bed pretending to sleep, but she could see him silhouetted against the window, a guardian keeping watch through the darkness. Something shifted inside her chest, a feeling she was afraid to examine too closely because it felt dangerously close to hope. The attack came 3 days later. Josephine was baking bread when she heard Patrick's shout of warning from outside. She dropped the dough and ran to the window in time to see 5 men approaching the cabin, Marcus in the lead. Her former captor looked even worse than she remembered, his face gaunt and his eyes wild with an obsession that made her stomach turn. Patrick stood in front of the cabin, rifle in hand, his body a wall of muscle and determination. "That is close enough, Sullivan. You have something that belongs to me, Barlow." Marcus's voice carried clearly in the crisp autumn air. "Send her out and we will leave peaceful. She does not belong to you. She does not belong to anyone." Patrick's finger rested on the rifle's trigger. "Now turn around and go back where you came from." "I cannot do that." Marcus drew his pistol and the 4 men with him followed suit. "Last chance, Barlow. Send her out or we will take her. You can try." Marcus fired first, the bullet slamming into the cabin wall a foot from where Patrick stood. Patrick dove behind a stack of firewood and returned fire, his shot taking one of Marcus's men in the shoulder. The man screamed and fell from his horse while the others scattered, taking cover behind trees. Josephine pressed herself against the cabin wall, her heart hammering. She could hear bullets thudding into the logs, could smell gunpowder in the air. Patrick fired steadily, each shot carefully aimed while Marcus and his men wasted ammunition in fury. But there were 5 of them and only one of Patrick, and Josephine knew that numbers would eventually tell. She looked around the cabin desperately, searching for something, anything, that might help. Her eyes landed on Patrick's spare rifle hanging above the door. She had never fired a gun in her life, but desperation made her bold. She grabbed the rifle, found the ammunition pouch hanging beside it, and loaded the weapon the way she had seen Patrick do. Moving to the window, Josephine took aim at one of the men crouched behind a tree. Her hands were shaking so badly, she could barely hold the rifle steady, but she forced herself to breathe deeply and squeeze the trigger the way Patrick had described when talking about hunting. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, sending her stumbling backward, and her shot went wide, splintering bark from the tree trunk. But it had the desired effect. The men turned, surprised to find themselves taking fire from 2 directions. In their moment of distraction, Patrick hit another one, the bullet catching him in the leg and sending him rolling down the slope screaming. "Get back inside," Patrick shouted to Josephine, but she ignored him, taking aim and firing again. This shot came closer, making one of Marcus's men duck and curse. The fight lasted another 10 minutes, but with 2 of his men down and facing more resistance than he had expected, Marcus finally called a retreat. He fired one last furious shot toward the cabin before spurring his horse away, his remaining men following close behind. Patrick waited several minutes to make sure they were really gone before lowering his rifle. Then he turned to Josephine, who was still standing at the window, her whole body trembling with adrenaline and fear. He crossed to her in 3 long strides and carefully took the rifle from her hands. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "So could you?" Josephine looked up at him, seeing a scratch on his cheek where a bullet had come too close. Without thinking, she reached up and touched the wound gently. "You are hurt. It is nothing." Patrick caught her hand, holding it against his face. "Josephine, what you did was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish. I could not just hide while you fought them alone." She tried to pull her hand back, but Patrick held it firmly. "I had to help. You did help. You may have saved both our lives." Patrick's thumb stroked across her knuckles. "But you scared me half to death. I scared you. You were the one standing out in the open taking on 5 armed men." Anger born of fear made her voice sharp. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking I would die before I let them take you." Patrick said it simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to risk his life for her. Josephine stared at him, at this mountain of a man who had shown her more kindness and protection in a few weeks than anyone else had in her entire life, and felt something crack open inside her chest. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that for me?" Patrick was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. Then he said, "Because somewhere between you flinching from me in that forest and you standing at that window firing a rifle to protect me, I fell in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, huge and terrifying and wonderful. Josephine's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he could not possibly love her, that love was not gentle touches and patient teaching but pain and possession. But looking into Patrick's eyes, she saw the truth of his words written plainly on his face. "I am broken," she said finally, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Marcus broke something inside me, and I do not know if it can be fixed." Patrick raised his other hand to cup her face, his touch infinitely gentle. "You are not broken. You are wounded, but wounds heal, and I would wait however long it takes if it means a chance to be with you. I do not know how to be loved." The confession hurt coming out. "I do not know how to trust that you will not hurt me. Then let me show you." Patrick leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. "Let me prove that not all men are like Marcus Sullivan." When his lips touched hers, it was the softest kiss Josephine had ever received. There was no demand in it, no expectation of more, just gentle affection and the promise of safety. She melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and kissed him back with all the desperate hope blooming in her chest. When they finally broke apart, Patrick rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Josephine Lancaster, and I will spend every day proving I am worthy of your trust if you will let me." "I think I might be falling in love with you too," Josephine whispered, "and that terrifies me more than anything Marcus could do." "I know." Patrick pulled her against his chest, wrapping his massive arms around her. "But we will figure it out together." They stood holding each other while the afternoon sun painted the cabin walls golden, two wounded souls finding healing in each other's presence. The next day, Patrick announced they were going to Stockton. Josephine protested, terrified of encountering Marcus or his men, but Patrick was firm. "We are going to the sheriff," he explained as he hitched his horse to a small cart. "We are going to make a report about Sullivan and get legal protection. You cannot live your life running and hiding, Josephine. What if the sheriff will not help? What if he is friends with Marcus? Then we will go over his head to the territorial marshal." Patrick helped her into the cart with hands that were steady and sure. "But we are going to do this right, through the law." The ride to Stockton took most of the day. Patrick stayed alert the entire time, his rifle within easy reach, but they saw no one on the lonely mountain road. Josephine spent the journey looking at the man beside her, this gentle giant who had become her protector and friend, and, impossibly, the man she loved. He caught her staring once and gave her a small smile that made her heart flutter. Stockton was a bustling town of about 5,000 people, thriving on the gold and silver still being pulled from the nearby mountains. The main street was crowded with wagons and horses, miners in work-stained clothes mingling with businessmen in suits, and painted ladies calling from the balconies of saloons. Josephine shrank into herself, afraid of being recognized, but Patrick's presence beside her was a solid comfort. The sheriff's office was a small building near the center of town. Patrick tied the horse outside and offered Josephine his arm, which she took gratefully. Inside, they found a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair sitting behind a battered desk, reading through a stack of papers. "Sheriff Thompson," Patrick said. The sheriff looked up, his sharp eyes taking in Patrick's size and Josephine's nervous demeanor. "That is me. What can I do for you folks?" Patrick told the story concisely, from finding Josephine in the forest to Marcus's attack on the cabin 3 days ago. The sheriff listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a piece of paper. When Patrick finished, the sheriff sat back and studied Josephine. "Is this how it happened, miss?" he asked. Josephine nodded, not trusting her voice. "And you were living with Marcus Sullivan without benefit of marriage?" "He took me on as hired help when my father died," Josephine said quietly. "He promised me room and board in exchange for cooking and cleaning. But once I was at his claim, he would not let me leave. He said I belonged to him." "Did he force himself on you?" The question was blunt but not unkind. Josephine's cheeks burned, but she met the sheriff's eyes. "No, He beat me when I did not obey him fast enough, but he never did that. That makes this easier." The sheriff stood. "What Sullivan did was illegal, miss. You were not his wife, which means he had no right to keep you against your will or to strike you. And his attack on Mr. Barlow's property was assault and attempted kidnapping. I will put out a warrant for his arrest." Relief flooded through Josephine so strongly her knees went weak. Patrick's arm came around her waist, supporting her. "Thank you, Sheriff. Thank me when Sullivan is behind bars." The sheriff pulled out a form and began filling it out. "In the meantime, I would suggest you folks stay alert. Sullivan has never struck me as the type to care much about warrants." After they left the sheriff's office, Patrick took Josephine to the general store and bought supplies with money he got from selling 3 of his carvings to the store owner. Josephine watched in amazement as the man counted out $20 for the wooden figures, more money than she had seen in months. "You should keep it," she said as they loaded the supplies into the cart. "You earned it." "We earned it," Patrick corrected. "And we need flour and sugar and fabric for a new dress for you." Josephine looked down at her threadbare gown, which she had been wearing for weeks. "I cannot let you buy me clothes. You are not letting me do anything. We are partners, remember?" Patrick's expression softened. "Besides, I want to see you in something pretty." The dress Patrick chose was a simple calico in deep blue with a white collar and cuffs. It was the most beautiful thing Josephine had owned in years, and when she tried it on in the store's back room, she almost cried at the sight of herself looking like a respectable woman again. They stayed the night at a boarding house Patrick knew, in separate rooms despite the curious looks from the proprietor. Josephine lay in the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the town through her window and thinking about Patrick in the room next door. She felt safer than she had any right to, knowing he was close by. The next morning, they started back to the cabin. They were about halfway there when a group of riders appeared on the road ahead. Josephine's breath caught when she recognized Marcus among them, along with 6 other men, more than he had brought to the cabin. "Get behind me," Patrick said quietly, reaching for his rifle, but Marcus held up his hands, showing he was unarmed. "I just want to talk, Barlow. Talk fast. We have business elsewhere." Patrick kept the rifle pointed at the ground but ready. "I will make you a deal." Marcus's eyes were on Josephine, filled with an obsessive hunger that made her skin crawl. "Give me the girl and $500 and I will leave you alone." "You want me to pay you for the privilege of kidnapping an innocent woman?" Patrick's voice was dangerously soft. "You are even more of a fool than I thought. That girl owes me for the months I fed her and kept a roof over her head." Marcus's face reddened. "I have a right to compensation." "You have a right to a jail cell, which is where you will be once the sheriff catches up with you." Patrick shifted, and the movement made every man in Marcus's group tense. "The lady stays with me. Now move aside before I move you." Marcus's face twisted with rage. "I will kill you, Barlow. I will burn your cabin to the ground and take that girl back if it is the last thing I do." "You can try." Patrick's voice was perfectly calm. "But I promise you will not succeed. Now get out of my way." For a long moment, the two groups faced each other on the narrow road, violence hanging in the air like summer lightning. Then Marcus spit in the dirt and yanked his horse's head around, galloping away with his men following. But Josephine saw the look on his face and knew this was far from over. They made it back to the cabin without further incident, but Patrick immediately began fortifying their defenses. He built shutters for the windows that could be barred from inside, stockpiled extra ammunition, and taught Josephine how to reload rifles quickly. She learned without complaint, understanding that her survival might depend on these skills. As the days passed, the fear of Marcus's return hung over them like a storm cloud. But in the evenings, Sitting by the fire carving or talking quietly, Josephine felt more content than she ever had. Patrick continued to court her with patient gentleness, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, and slowly Josephine's trust in him grew. One evening in early November, a light snow was falling when Patrick asked, "What did you dream of before? Before Sullivan, before your father died? What did you want from life?" Josephine thought about it, surprised to realize how long it had been since she allowed herself to dream. "I wanted a home, a real home with a family of my own, children to raise and a husband who was kind. It seems foolish now. It does not seem foolish at all." Patrick set down his carving and looked at her seriously. "What if I could give you that?" Josephine's heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" Patrick got up and crossed to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Marry me, Josephine. Let me be the husband you dreamed of. Let me give you a home and a family and all the kindness you deserve." Tears sprang to Josephine's eyes. "Patrick, I am not sure I am ready." "Then we will wait until you are." Patrick raised her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I am not going anywhere. When you are ready, if you are ever ready, I will be here. You would wait for me, even not knowing if I will ever be able to say yes. I would wait forever for you, Josephine Lancaster." Patrick's gray eyes were steady and sure. "You are worth waiting for." Josephine leaned forward and kissed him, pouring into it all the love and gratitude and hope she felt. When they broke apart, she whispered, "Ask me again at Christmas." "Christmas?" Patrick's face lit up with hope. "Christmas," Josephine confirmed. "Give me until then to be sure I can be the wife you deserve." Patrick pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "You already are everything I could want, but I will wait until Christmas, and every day after if that is what you need." The weeks leading up to Christmas passed in a blur of preparation. Patrick hunted deer and elk to build up their meat stores, while Josephine preserved everything she could from the garden Patrick had planted in the spring. They worked together cutting and stacking firewood for the winter, and in the evenings they sat close by the fire, touching becoming more natural and comfortable between them. Josephine found herself healing in ways she had not thought possible. Patrick's patient affection and unwavering respect slowly convinced her that not all men were like Marcus. When she flinched at sudden movements, Patrick would stop and wait until she calmed. When nightmares woke her in the middle of the night, he would sit outside her door, talking quietly until she felt safe enough to sleep again. He never complained, never demanded more than she could give, and his consistency built a foundation of trust stronger than stone. 2 weeks before Christmas, the sheriff came riding up to the cabin. Patrick grabbed his rifle, but the lawman raised his hands peacefully. "Relax, Barlow, I have good news." Sheriff Thompson dismounted and tied his horse. "Marcus Sullivan is in custody." "How?" Patrick lowered the rifle. "Turns out he was wanted in Nevada for claim jumping and assault. The marshals caught up with him in Sacramento trying to hire more men to come after you." The sheriff's expression was satisfied. "He will be going to prison for a long time. You folks do not need to worry about him anymore." Josephine felt something loosen in her chest, a tight band of fear she had been carrying for months. "He is really gone," the sheriff confirmed. "Thought you would want to know." After the sheriff left, Josephine and Patrick stood looking at each other. Then Josephine started to laugh, and once she started, she could not stop. Patrick caught her as her legs gave out, holding her while she laughed and cried simultaneously, all the terror and tension draining out of her in great racking sobs. "It is over," she gasped against his chest. "It is really over." "It is over," Patrick confirmed, his arms tight around her. "You are safe now, you are free." That night, Josephine slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time since her father's death. When she woke, she found Patrick making breakfast, humming tunelessly to himself. She watched him for a long moment, this gentle giant who had saved her life and taught her to trust again, and knew what her answer would be at Christmas. The days before Christmas passed in a flurry of activity. Patrick disappeared into the forest for hours at a time, returning with mysterious bundles he would not let Josephine see. For her part, Josephine used the fabric they had bought in Stockton to make Patrick a new shirt, working on it while he was out and hiding it whenever he returned. Christmas Eve arrived clear and cold, with snow covering the ground in a thick blanket of white. Patrick went out early and returned with a small pine tree, which he set up in the corner of the cabin. Together, they decorated it with paper chains Josephine made and small carved ornaments Patrick had created. When the tree was finished, they stood back to admire their work. It was simple compared to the elaborate Christmas displays Josephine remembered from her childhood, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. "Josephine," Patrick said, his voice suddenly serious. "It is Christmas Eve, I know." Josephine turned to face him, her heart racing. "I promised I would wait until Christmas to ask again." Patrick took both her hands in his gray eyes searching her face. "Have you thought about it?" "I have thought of little else." Josephine squeezed his hands. "Patrick Barlow, I am still afraid. I am probably always going to be a little afraid after what Marcus did to me. But I am not too afraid to recognize a good man when I see one, and you are the best man I have ever known." Hope dawned on Patrick's face. "Josephine, yes," she interrupted him. "Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I want to build a life with you. Yes to all of it." Patrick's whoop of joy shook the rafters. He swept her up into his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he finally set her down, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her deeply. And for the first time, Josephine kissed him back without any shadow of fear between them. "I made you something," Patrick said when they finally broke apart. He crossed to the corner where he had been hiding his mysterious bundles and returned with a wooden box. "Open it." Inside was a carving of two wolves, their bodies intertwined, so detailed Josephine could see individual hairs in their fur. It was the most beautiful thing Patrick had ever made, a testament to hours of patient work. "They are us," Patrick explained. "Wolves mate for life. Once they choose each other, they stay together through everything. That is what I want with you, Josephine, a partnership that lasts a lifetime." Tears streamed down Josephine's face as she traced the carving with gentle fingers. "It is perfect. Patrick, it is the most wonderful gift I have ever received. I am glad you like it." Patrick smiled, then looked nervous. "I have something else, too." He pulled a small wooden ring from his pocket, carved from what looked like dark walnut with delicate flowers etched around the band. "I know it is not gold or silver, but I made it for you. Until I can afford something better, it is perfect," Josephine interrupted, slipping it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, warm against her skin. "I would not trade it for all the gold in California." They celebrated their engagement with a feast of venison and fresh bread, and when the meal was finished, Josephine gave Patrick her gift. His face lit up when he saw the new shirt, and he immediately put it on, even though it was too warm to wear inside the cabin. "You made this for me." He ran his hands over the careful stitching. "I wanted you to have something nice." Josephine felt suddenly shy. "Something that shows how much I appreciate everything you have done for me." Patrick pulled her into his arms, careful of her healing ribs. "Josephine, you being here is all the gift I need. Everything else is just a wonderful surprise." That night, they sat by the fire wrapped in each other's arms, planning their future. They would marry in Stockton as soon as the mountain passes were clear in the spring. Patrick would expand the cabin to give them more room for the children they both wanted. Josephine would start a garden in the clearing behind the cabin, growing vegetables to supplement what Patrick hunted and trapped. "I want at least 4 children," Patrick said, his hand stroking through Josephine's hair. "Maybe more if you are willing. 4 sounds perfect." Josephine smiled against his chest. "2 boys and 2 girls. We cannot exactly choose, you know." Patrick's laugh rumbled through his chest. "We can hope, though." Josephine tilted her head back to look at him. "Will you be disappointed if our first is a girl?" "I will love whatever children we are blessed with," Patrick said seriously. "Boy or girl, it does not matter, as long as they are healthy and you are safe." Josephine kissed him, pouring into it all the love and trust she had learned to feel again. "I love you, Patrick Barlow." "I love you too, Josephine Lancaster, soon to be Josephine Barlow." Patrick held her closer. "And I promise to spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." Winter passed slowly in the mountains, but for Josephine and Patrick, the months flew by in a blur of contentment. They were snowed in for weeks at a time, but the cabin remained warm and cozy. Patrick taught Josephine to trap small animals, and she became surprisingly good at it, her quick hands and patient nature serving her well. In the evenings, they carved together, or Patrick read aloud from the few books he owned while Josephine worked on sewing projects. As the days grew longer and the snow began to melt, they prepared for their journey to Stockton. Patrick bought Josephine a new dress for the wedding, a beautiful cream-colored gown that made her feel like a princess. She spent hours altering it to fit perfectly, wanting to look her best when she became his wife. They left for Stockton on a bright April morning in 1876. The mountain passes finally clear enough for safe travel. The journey took 2 days, and they spent the night at the same boarding house as before. This time, the proprietor smiled knowingly when she saw Patrick's hand on Josephine's back and wished them well. The wedding took place in a small church on Main Street, with Sheriff Thompson and the minister's wife serving as witnesses. Josephine wore her cream dress with wildflowers in her hair that Patrick had picked that morning. Patrick wore his new shirt and had trimmed his hair and beard, looking more civilized than Josephine had ever seen him, though no less imposing, when the minister asked if Patrick would take Josephine as his lawfully wedded wife. His "I do" rang through the church with absolute certainty. And when Josephine spoke her own vows, her voice was strong and clear, free of the fear that had haunted her for so long. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said. "You may kiss your bride." Patrick's kiss was gentle and reverent, a promise of all the years to come. When they broke apart, both were smiling through tears of joy. The boarding house proprietor insisted on making them a wedding supper, complete with a small cake she had baked that morning. Sheriff Thompson raised a glass of whiskey and toasted to their happiness and many children. Josephine blushed but squeezed Patrick's hand under the table, already hoping the sheriff's toast would prove prophetic. That night, in the privacy of their room, Patrick was patient and gentle, making sure Josephine felt safe and cherished. He took his time, checking constantly that she was comfortable, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. And when they finally came together as husband and wife, it was nothing like the painful, frightening experience Josephine had feared. Instead, it was tender and sweet, 2 people who loved each other expressing that love in the most intimate way possible. Afterward, Patrick held her close, stroking her hair as she pressed against his chest. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "Better than all right." Josephine kissed his shoulder. "I love you, husband. I love you too, wife." Patrick's arms tightened around her. "Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for giving me a chance when you had every reason not to. Thank you for being worth trusting." Josephine tilted her head back to look at him. "Thank you for saving me and protecting me and loving me even when I was broken." "You were never broken," Patrick said firmly. Wounded, yes, but never broken. You are the strongest person I know, Josephine Barlow. They returned to the cabin a few days later to find spring in full bloom throughout the forest. The meadow behind the cabin was carpeted with wildflowers, and deer grazed peacefully in the early morning light. Josephine stood in the doorway, looking at the place that had become her sanctuary and then her home, and felt her heart swell with contentment. Patrick came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. Happy. Happier than I ever thought possible, Josephine admitted, covering his hands with hers. When I ran from Marcus that day, I thought my life was over. I never imagined I would find you. I never imagined I would find you either. Patrick kissed the top of her head. But I am grateful every day that I did. Spring turned to summer, and summer to fall. Josephine's belly began to swell with their first child, and Patrick became even more protective than before, insisting on doing all the heavy work while she rested. She protested but secretly loved his concern, finding it endearing rather than controlling. In late October, with the first snow of the season beginning to fall, Josephine went into labor. Patrick, usually so calm and capable, became a nervous wreck, hovering over her and offering to ride to Stockton for the doctor. Josephine laughed through her contractions and told him there was no time, that the baby was coming whether the doctor was there or not. The labor was long and hard, but when the sun rose the next morning, Patrick held his newborn son, tears streaming down his face. The baby had a cap of dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead, and Patrick thought he had never seen anything more beautiful. What should we name him? Josephine asked from the bed, exhausted but glowing with happiness. Patrick looked down at his son, at this tiny perfect person he and Josephine had created together, and said, "James, after your father." Fresh tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks. Her father had been dead for over a year, but the pain of his loss still ached sometimes. Naming their son after him felt like keeping a piece of her father alive. James Barlow. It is perfect. Baby James thrived in the mountain cabin, growing strong and healthy on his mother's milk. Patrick proved to be a devoted father, rocking the baby to sleep when he fussed and changing diapers without complaint. Josephine watched her husband with their son and fell even more deeply in love with him. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, and they named her Elizabeth after Patrick's mother. She had Josephine's delicate features and Patrick's gray eyes, and her father declared her the most beautiful girl ever born. 2 years after that came another boy, Samuel, who had his father's size and seemed destined to be as large as Patrick. And finally, when Josephine was 30 years old, they welcomed their fourth child, a daughter named Mary who completed their family. The cabin had been expanded 3 times to accommodate their growing family, and Patrick had built a proper barn for the cow and chickens they now kept. Josephine's garden flourished, providing vegetables throughout the summer and preserves for the winter. Patrick's carving business had grown, with people from as far away as Sacramento commissioning pieces from him. Life was not always easy. Winters were still harsh, and illness sometimes struck the family. But through it all, Patrick and Josephine faced everything together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. One evening, 15 years after they had first met in that forest clearing, Josephine sat on the porch watching Patrick teach James and Samuel how to split wood. Elizabeth was inside helping Mary with her reading lessons, and the sounds of their laughter drifted through the open window. Josephine rested her hand on her belly, where a 5th child grew, and smiled at the life she had built. Patrick caught her eye and grinned, setting down his axe and crossing to sit beside her. "What are you thinking about, wife?" "About how lucky I am," Josephine said honestly. about how different my life could have been if you had not been in that clearing the day I ran from Marcus. I think we were both lucky that day." Patrick took her hand, his thumb stroking over the wooden ring she still wore alongside the gold band he had bought her years ago. She had refused to take the wooden ring off, saying it reminded her of the day she had agreed to marry him. "You saved me as much as I saved you, Josephine. Before you, I was just existing, not really living. You gave me a reason to be human again." Josephine leaned her head against his broad shoulder, feeling his arm come around her. "I love you, Patrick Barlow. More today than yesterday, and more tomorrow than today. And I love you, Josephine Barlow." Patrick kissed her forehead. "Forever and always." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Barlow family gathered on the porch. James sat at his father's feet, listening to a story about the old days. Samuel climbed into Josephine's lap despite being almost too big for it. Elizabeth and Mary leaned against each other, watching the stars begin to appear. Josephine looked at her family, at the husband who had saved her and loved her, and given her everything she had ever dreamed of, at the children who filled her days with joy and purpose. And she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The scared, broken girl who had fled through the forest so many years ago was gone, replaced by a woman who was strong and loved and free. And when Patrick caught her eye across the porch and smiled that gentle smile that was only for her, Josephine smiled back, her heart full to overflowing with contentment. She had found her home in these mountains, but more importantly, she had found her home in Patrick's arms. And that was a gift more precious than all the gold in California. The years continued to pass in gentle succession, each season bringing its own joys and challenges. James grew into a serious young man with his mother's quick mind and his father's strength. He showed an aptitude for his father's carving work and spent hours learning the craft at Patrick's side. Samuel was more adventurous, always exploring the forests and bringing home stories of the wildlife he encountered. Elizabeth inherited her mother's nurturing nature and helped care for her younger siblings with patience and grace. Mary was the wild one, climbing trees and refusing to wear shoes whenever she could get away with it, making both her parents laugh with her antics. The fifth baby, another boy they named Thomas, completed their family when Josephine was 32. Patrick declared he was done, that 5 children were more than enough, and Josephine agreed, content with the boisterous, loving family they had created. Life in the mountains had its hardships. There were years when game was scarce, and they had to ration carefully to make their supplies last through the winter. There was the year Mary got sick with a fever that terrified them both, until it finally broke after 3 days of careful nursing. There was the forest fire that came within a mile of their cabin before the wind shifted and pushed it away. But for every hardship, there were 100 moments of joy. James's face the first time he successfully carved a recognizable animal. Samuel bringing home a wounded rabbit and nursing it back to health with gentle hands. Elizabeth's wedding to a kind young man from Stockton when she was 19, with the whole family making the journey down the mountain to celebrate. Mary learning to read and devouring every book she could get her hands on. Thomas taking his first steps, arms outstretched toward his father through it all. Patrick remained Josephine's rock, his love constant and unwavering. He never raised his hand to her in anger, never spoke a harsh word even when she deserved it. When she woke from nightmares about Marcus, which still happened occasionally even years later, Patrick would hold her and remind her she was safe. When the hard work of raising 5 children in the wilderness exhausted her, Patrick would take over without complaint, letting her rest. and Josephine loved him with a fierce devotion that only grew stronger with time. She made sure he had fresh shirts and good meals. She listened to his worries about the children and offered advice when he asked for it. She kept their home warm and welcoming, a refuge from the harsh world outside. And she never, not even once, regretted her decision to marry him. On their 20th anniversary, Patrick surprised Josephine by taking her back to the clearing where they had first met. The children were old enough to be left on their own for a few hours, with James in charge, and Patrick led his wife through the familiar forest paths. "Do you remember this place?" Patrick asked when they reached the clearing. "How could I forget?" Josephine looked around, memories flooding back. "I thought my life was over when I ran through here. I thought Marcus would kill me if he caught me. And instead you ran into me." Patrick pulled her into his arms. "The best day of my life." "Mine too," Josephine admitted. "Even though I was terrified of you at first, I know. You flinched every time I moved." Patrick's expression grew sad. "It broke my heart to see how frightened you were. You healed that fear." Josephine reached up to touch his face, noting the gray that now streaked through his dark hair and beard. They were both older now, marked by time and hard work, but to her, Patrick was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. "You showed me what love was supposed to be. Patient and kind and gentle. You made me human again," Patrick countered. "Before you, I was just going through the motions of living. You gave me a reason to care, a reason to hope for the future." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a carved wooden box. "I made you something." Inside the box was a carving of their family: Patrick, Josephine, and all 5 children, each figure carefully detailed and recognizable. It must have taken months to create, hours stolen while Josephine slept or was occupied with other tasks. Tears streamed down her face as she studied it, seeing the love in every careful cut of the knife. "Patrick, this is incredible." She looked up at him through her tears. "When did you find time to make this?" "I have been working on it for the past year." Patrick looked pleased by her reaction. "I wanted to capture this moment in our lives before the children are all grown and gone, something we can look at when we are old and remember these days." Josephine threw her arms around him, the box clutched carefully between them. "I love it. I love you. Thank you for 20 years of happiness. Thank you for saying yes when I asked you to marry me." Patrick kissed her deeply. "And for giving me a family I never thought I would have." They made love in the clearing where they had first met, the afternoon sun warm on their skin, reconnecting in the place where their story had begun. When they finally headed back to the cabin, walking hand in hand through the forest, Josephine felt young again, full of the same hope and promise she had felt on their wedding day. The children were waiting when they got home, with a special dinner they had prepared themselves as an anniversary surprise. The meal was slightly burned and the cake was lopsided, but it was made with love, and that was what mattered. The family gathered around the table, laughing and talking over each other, and Patrick and Josephine exchanged a look of perfect understanding and contentment. As the years passed, and their children grew into adults with families of their own, Patrick and Josephine remained in their mountain cabin. They became grandparents, delighting in visits from their growing brood of grandchildren. Patrick taught them all to carve, while Josephine told them stories and baked cookies that disappeared almost as fast as she could make them. James took over much of the trap line work as Patrick's joints began to ache with age. Samuel became a guide, taking wealthy men from back east on hunting trips through the mountains. Elizabeth lived in Stockton with her husband and 4 children, but visited several times a year. Mary, true to her wild nature, had married a trapper and lived even deeper in the mountains than her parents. Thomas stayed closest to home, building his own cabin just a mile away and helping his father with whatever was needed. When Patrick was 65 and Josephine 62, they finally decided it was time to take things easier. Thomas and his wife moved into the cabin with them, taking over the daily chores while Patrick and Josephine enjoyed the freedom to rest when they needed to. One evening, sitting on the porch watching the sunset as they had done thousands of times before, Josephine said, "Do you have any regrets, Patrick?" "Only one." Patrick took her weathered hand in his. "That we did not have more years together, that we did not meet when we were younger. But if we had met younger, we would not have been the people we were when we found each other." Josephine squeezed his hand. "You needed those years in the mountains to become the man I fell in love with, and I needed my trials to appreciate what we have. You are probably right." Patrick lifted her hand to his lips. "Still, I would have liked a few extra years with you." "We have had almost 40 years, Josephine pointed out. "That is more than many people get, and every single day I have been grateful for you, as I have been grateful for you." Patrick pulled her close and she rested her head on his shoulder, fitting against him as perfectly as she had the first time. "I love you, Josephine Barlow, until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Patrick Barlow." Josephine closed her eyes, content. "My mountain man, my savior, my love." They sat together as the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and built a life filled with love and laughter and purpose. The scared girl who had run through the forest and the lonely man who had saved her were long gone, replaced by partners who had weathered every storm together and emerged stronger for it. Patrick's hand rose to wipe away a happy tear that had escaped down Josephine's cheek, the gesture as gentle as it had been that first day in the forest when she had flinched from him. But she did not flinch now, had not flinched in 40 years. Instead, she leaned into his touch, trusting him completely, loving him with every fiber of her being. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the Barlow family gathered on the porch, children and grandchildren filling the space with noise and love. Patrick and Josephine sat at the center of it all, the foundation upon which this beautiful, chaotic family had been built, their hands intertwined and their hearts full. It was, Josephine thought as she looked around at the faces of the people she loved most in the world, the perfect ending to a story that had started with fear and pain, but had transformed into something beautiful beyond imagining. She had found her home, her purpose, and her great love in these mountains. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would not change a single moment of the journey that had brought her here. Patrick caught her eye and smiled, that gentle smile that was only for her, and Josephine smiled back, her heart overflowing with joy. They had built something precious together, something that would outlast them both in the children and grandchildren who carried their legacy forward. And that was the greatest gift of all. As the evening deepened and the family began to head to their respective homes, Patrick and Josephine remained on the porch, reluctant to end the perfect day. The mountain air was cool and clean, filled with the scent of pine and the distant sound of the creek that ran behind their property. An owl hooted somewhere in the darkness, and crickets sang their evening song. "Come to bed, love," Patrick finally said, standing and offering Josephine his hand. "It has been a long day." Josephine took his hand and let him help her up, her body no longer as spry as it once had been but her spirit still strong. Together they walked into the cabin that had been their home for 40 years, closing the door on another day in a lifetime of days they had spent together. And as they lay in bed that night, Patrick's arms around Josephine just as they had been every night since their wedding, both knew they had been blessed beyond measure. They had found love when neither was looking for it, had built a family from the ashes of broken pasts, and had created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. It was more than enough. It was everything. And when sleep finally claimed them both, they slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and cherished, today and always, until the mountains themselves crumbled to dust and beyond.